welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. Welcome to all of us who are here together tonight, and welcome to everyone who's joining us online. It's a great pleasure to be here. Tonight we continue on with our series, A Journey to Faith, following the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham through to Jesus. Tonight's lesson is called Zerubbabel Finishes Rebuilding the Temple of Jerusalem, and we're on lesson number 71, so we've come a long way through the journey of the Bible. In tonight's lesson we pick up during the era of King Darius I of Persia, and so before we get underway I'll just give you some information from the genealogy and also from the genealogy list of kings. So first of all, we are progressing through the genealogy of Jesus. It's found in Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 to 17. The portion which is after the exile to Babylon is in verses 12 to 17. We've got this fellow here, Jeconiah, who's actually King Jehoiachin, the last of the kings listed in the genealogy, whom was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel is the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel we will be looking at again tonight. This is the third lesson in the series that covers the time of Zerubbabel, and a very important person. And his name, as we mentioned before, Babel stands for Babylon, and Zerub means offspring of. So Zerubbabel is the only offspring that was born in the genealogy of Jesus whilst in Babylonian exile. Now, during his time, we find that there was a change of numerous Persian rulers and the end of the Babylonian rule, but at this particular lesson now we're on the last of the Persian kings in orange here, and so we're looking at the time during the reign of King Darius the Great, or King Darius I, whom is involved in the scriptures during the time of Zerubbabel. This is a picture that is engraved in an inscription of King Darius, and this is what his appearance looks like. Okay, so we're going to start off tonight having a look at a scripture from the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 11. Now we're going to be delving into three books tonight quite heavily, with a couple of minor scriptures, but we're going to be looking at the book of Ezra, which is more towards the end. We're going to be looking at the book of Haggai the prophet, and we're also going to be looking at the book of Zechariah the prophet. And if you're not sure, or you haven't learned this before, both Haggai and Zechariah were placed amongst the returned exiles to be amongst the people, to keep them online, to make sure that they fulfill God's plan to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. Towards the end of the lesson, we not only read from the book of Ezra, but we in fact introduce Ezra as he returns to Jerusalem himself from exile with some other people, and he comes in to put in the practice of the law again, and to also do a bit of rebuking when he first gets there, because there's some intermarriage going on between the Jewish people and those who were around them. So starting off, because of the decree of King Darius I of Persia, and no doubt his threat of impaling them on a beam if they did not comply. So this comes from chapter 6 of Ezra, verse 11. The governor Tattenai, his secretary Shethar-bozenai, and the officials of the province of West Euphrates diligently carried out his command. So just referencing the previous lessons, we found that those who came against the people who were rebuilding the returned exiles, King Darius of Persia, he looked up the original decree of King Cyrus, who first released Zerubbabel and the returned exiles, and he reinforced that this was to be the case, and he told those who were coming against them that if they were to do anything not to help them, that he would actually have them impaled on a beam or a pole. And so that comes from that scripture. So on the 21st day of the 7th month in the 2nd year of King Darius I of Persia, the prophet Haggai came again to speak with Zerubbabel, the governor. And so we've established last week that Zerubbabel became the governor over Jerusalem and, of course, Judah at that point in time. He also spoke with Jeshua the high priest and the remnant people in Jerusalem to give them the word of the Lord. He asked if anyone had seen the first temple before asking how it looked now and whether it appeared like nothing. So this might sound a bit odd. How's that temple looking? Why doesn't it look like anything's happening? And that's what he's basically saying. So as I read on, we're going to go to the book of Haggai now, chapter 2. So if you flip there whilst I continue. These questions were pointed and unsettling, and as Zerubbabel listened, the prophet reassuringly declared the word of the Lord. So we're going to read from Haggai chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. And it says, "But now be strong, O Zerubbabel, be strong, O Joshua son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, and work, for I am with you. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear." And so, of course, we understand here that this is the prophet. This is not his words. He's actually relating the words of the Lord to the people through the prophet. Now, on what was called the Behistun inscription that King Darius had, and I showed you this the previous week. This is a place in today's Iran called Kermanshah, and the Behistun inscription is actually this carving in this wall here. It looks very small, but in fact it is very large. And on this inscription there's various graphics in the release, and there's various texts that have actually been written for. And so we looked at that in last week's lesson, but for the purpose of this week's lesson, the portion that we want to reference is that King Darius had proclaimed, "I restored that which had been taken away, as it was in the days of old. This did I by the grace of Ahura Mazda." And so this was him restoring everything back in the kingdom to how it was when King Cyrus the Great had first established the Persian Empire. So whilst this may seem comforting, he claimed that it was by the grace of Ahura Mazda. The Lord Almighty, however, made it clear that it was by his will that what was covenanted will be restored. And so when we read that scripture from Haggai chapter 2 verse 4 to 5, the Lord said, "This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt." So he's talking about the fact that he had a covenant with his people, which originated during the time of Egypt. But it still stands. It didn't go away. It still stands now. And so when the people return from Babylonian exile, the same covenant covers them at this point in time. So the Lord Almighty made it clear, and they assured that his spirit, Ruach Elohim, the Holy Spirit, is amongst them and not to fear. And so his message through Haggai here is, don't fear, I am with you. So the prophet Haggai then spoke of a future time when the Messiah, the desired of all nations, will come. And so we now read from Haggai 2, verses 6 to 7. It says, "In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory." So Haggai has spoken about the present at that point in time, and then now he's speaking about something that is yet to come. So if I ask you the question, who is the desired of all nations will come, whom is he talking about there? He's talking about Jesus, that's right. And so as the prophets continue to do, they prophesy over the immediate circumstances, the immediate future, and they also speak at the same time that something will come in the future which will be unshakable and will not be able to be changed. And so in this case, he says, "I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory." Now, of course, you've got to realise where he is. He's in Jerusalem. We're talking about the temple of Jerusalem. And so when he says, "I will fill this house with glory," he's talking about God's house, the temple of Jerusalem. So soon after, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of King Darius I of Persia, Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, also gave the word of the Lord. And so now we're going to go to the book of Zechariah. So again, I hope you've got your multiple bookmarks with you. So we're going to go to the book of Zechariah, and we're going to go to chapter 1, and we're going to be covering quite a bit from Zechariah this week. So Zechariah chapter 1, verses 3 to 6. And it reads, "Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. Do not be like your forefathers, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. Where are your forefathers now? And the prophets, do they live forever? But did not my words and decrees, which I commanded my servants the prophets, overtake your forefathers?" And so Zechariah's word of the Lord is basically saying all those prophets who came earlier than now, before you were put into exile and now returned, where are they? Did people listen to them? Did it go well for them? No. And so he says, take notice of this, because this situation has overtaken your forefathers, meaning they lost control because they didn't walk their life obediently to the will of God. And so there was a consequence. So reading on from Zechariah 1 verse 6, "The people who were in Jerusalem repented and said, the Lord Almighty has done to us what our ways and practices deserved, just as he determined to do." So they actually acknowledge that their ways had not been God's ways. So these were necessary words of warning, for when the exiles returned, they had been more determined to build their own homes than the house of the Lord. So they were reminded of those who had come before them. Whether they were those who preached or those who heard, they all died, but the word of the Lord and his covenant will continue to live on. And so the message and the circumstances that's happening is, whilst they came back to Jerusalem, they were to settle in their homes, but their priority was first build the altar to God, and second it was to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. But what the Bible's telling us is that once people got back to their homes again and got comfortable, they focused on their own places and not on the temple of Jerusalem. So things were going very, very slow. So again, on the 24th day of the 9th month of the second year of King Darius of Persia, so the Bible keeps dating everything for us, and we'll cover some dates in a few moments, the word of the Lord came again to the prophet Haggai. So going to Haggai, I'm going to keep bouncing you back and forth between these two books. We've got a few scriptures now from Haggai. So Haggai chapter 2, verse 12 this time. "He asked the priests, if a person carries consecrated meat in the fold of his garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? The priests answered, no. So Haggai said in verse 13, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? This time they answered, yes. So Haggai said in verses 14 to 15, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer is defiled. Now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. And so he's reminding them of what happened before. He keeps drawing back on the past experience and saying, you don't want to go down this path again because it didn't go well for your forefathers. So because the returned exiles had not trusted in God and continued to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, they had been cursed. The Lord Almighty had sent the prophets Haggai and Zechariah amongst them to stir them up and reassure them that he was with them. So reading on now from Haggai chapter 2 verses 16 to 19. It says, when anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail, yet you did not turn to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple
was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. And so we learn here that things hadn't been going well for the people since they returned, because they weren't doing what the Lord had told them to do. And he tells them through the prophet here that he's actually cursed their own productivity or their own ability to gain wealth through their own means, because they had not fulfilled what they were there to do. And so now through the prophet Haggai, he speaks to the people and tells them so they realize what's actually going on. And he says from now on that I will bless you. But what does he expect them to do in order to be blessed? To build his house. And so they're in a covenant, they're in a contract. And so God expects them to do. He said that he would bring them back, but remember what the decree of King Cyrus said. He said that the reason that they would bring them back was to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, not to have their homes and have a nice life, but to rebuild God's house. That was the reason for coming back. And so these people have got home, they've got comfortable, they've got their inheritance back, and straight away they start focusing on themselves again. And so Haggai's come in through with the word of the Lord and said, listen, it's not going to go well, but I will bless you as long as you do what you're here for. And so, going to Haggai chapter 2, verses 20 to 22, it says, the word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. And it says, tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers, horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. So the Lord told Zerubbabel he will take care of him and his people. They're very strong words. Their earthly enemies and overlords will be overcome by their own brothers, their fellow men, fellow worshippers of other gods. And so God's saying, instead of focusing on those around you, they're all going to continue to fight amongst each other because they're trying to grow earthly power, earthly wealth. So just let them go for it and I'll take care of you. He protected them because he gave the decree through King Cyrus the Great, and King Darius the First, his grandnephew or his great nephew, said, I'm going to uphold what King Cyrus said. So they don't need to worry about what's going on around them. We spoke about this a bit in last week's lesson. So this is a thing about trust. Do they trust in the Lord? So after Zerubbabel received word that the Lord would protect him and the people he had been entrusted with, God said to him in Haggai 2, verse 23, and I've got this up on the screen behind me here because I'm using this picture. It is an Egyptian signet ring, but it's a great example of a signet ring. And it says, on that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. And so once again, if we understand what a signet ring is a ring that you wear that gives you the authority to rule over a people, right? And so when he gave the signet ring to Zerubbabel, he's giving him the authority to be the leader of his people to fulfill the task that he appointed him to do. So many years earlier, when Joseph was given a signet ring by the Pharaoh in Egypt, like this one, not only did it give him a visible mark of honour to rule over the populace, but it showed them he had the authority to rule because it was a symbol of the inheritance of the Pharaoh's family. And so it was here that Zerubbabel was not only chosen to lead God's people and build his temple, but received God's authority as a man of the covenant with whom God had promised the Messiah will come. Zerubbabel was a forefather of Jesus Christ. And so when he gave him this signet ring, he gave him authority. And this is what we must remember. But the authority that he gave here was to lead his people and to build his temple. when he gave it to Joseph, it was to lead his people, but also to lead the Egyptian people and to take care of his own people when they came, to prosper them. And so God's hand is always on these situations. So both times, when there's a situation of exile or return from exile, God was in it, making sure that he had his own leaders. What happened in Babylon during the time of the Babylonian Empire? He placed Daniel in there, and he continually got appointed to rule over Babylon. And so God does this. Okay, so on the 24th day of the 11th month of Shevat, which is known as Shevat, it's January or February in our calendar, in the second year of Darius the first of Persia, I'm going to put this up on the board in a moment, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah. And so we're going to be reading now through a number of prophecies from Zechariah. Now you might notice, I don't know if you have, but every time something happens, it says on the 24th day of the whichever month of the whichever year. It's always on the 24th day, so it's quite numerically specific. So we're going to go now, and we're actually going to work through a series of visions. Okay, and so here is this information here. This date actually works out to be in 520 BC. And so we're talking about the 24th day of the 11th month, so it's actually January to February in the second year of rule for King Darius I of Persia in 520 BC. The word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Now there's a series of visions that he has, and we're going to roll through each of these. The thing is though, is that the day doesn't change. You will read one after another, and you'll realise that they actually came one after another, so they're all on the same day at the same time. And so this first vision that we've got here, we're going to be reading from Zechariah chapter 1, verses 8 to 11. And you can see the pictures here of the 4 horses, and there's a portion here which I'll have for each of the visions. It says, there before me was a man riding a red horse, and another portion behind him were red, brown, and white horses. So let's have a look at this vision. So it reads from verse 8 to 11 of Zechariah 1, during the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man riding a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. I asked, what are these, my lord? The angel who was talking with me answered, I will show you what they are. Then the man standing among the myrtle trees explained, they are the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth. And they reported to the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees, we have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace. Who would like to hazard a guess at what's going on there? So this is in the present at that time. Okay, so it says, we have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace. What does that mean? Who's ruling at this point in time? King Darius the first of Persia. And so the Persian Achaemenid Empire is at peace under Darius the first. In the previous lesson we learnt he went and fought in 1 year something like 19 battles all over the empire to bring things back into order, because before him of course there'd been the usurpers who had pretended to be the son of King Cyrus the Great. Okay, so he restored order, and so at this point in time Zechariah kicks off and says we've restored order. So the world under the rule of Persian Achaemenid Empire was at peace in the second year of the reign of King Darius I, and this was confirmed by the angel of the Lord. In Zechariah's vision, the angel in the form of a man was a messenger. He spoke with God and then spoke with Zechariah. He asked, so we're going to read now from verses 12 to 17, again Zechariah chapter 1, verses 12 to 17. He asked God, Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah which you have been angry with these 70 years. So the Lord spoke kind and comforting words to the angel who talked with me. Then the angel who was speaking to me said, "Proclaim this word. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I am very jealous for Jerusalem and Zion, but I am very angry with the nations that feel secure. Therefore this is what the Lord says. I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord Almighty. Proclaim further, my towns will again overflow with prosperity, and the Lord will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem." What do you think he's saying there? What's the Lord going to do? What's the purpose for them returning back to Jerusalem?
Restore it.
To restore it, to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. Who resides in the temple of Jerusalem? Whose house is it?
God.
It's God's. And so he says, when you rebuild my house, I will have mercy on you, I will return, and I will prosper you. He's having mercy on them because there's a reference there to his people were taken away in exile. In other words, they were put under Babylonian rule for the 70 years. So there's a reference to what happened under the previous empire. And so he said he's been merciful, he's brought them back, but again, you've got to build my temple, and then I'll come and be amongst you, and you will be prosperous once again. So the Lord confirmed that after 70 years in exile, he will have mercy on his people. His house, the temple of Jerusalem, will be rebuilt, and his towns that up to now have been cursed will again flow with prosperity. This confirmed what the Lord said to his people through the prophet Haggai. No need to look this up because we already read it, but in from Haggai 2 verses 16 to 19, part of what it said there was, "From this day on I will bless you." So in other words, they've got to build the temple of Jerusalem, and he will return, and from this day on he will bless them. So he keeps repeating through the prophets, because remember his prophets are amongst his people speaking to them, and they're trying to get through to these people. You really got to get back into action again. So the vision of the prophet Zechariah had not finished, for he looked up, and what did he see next? He saw 4 horns. And so he asked the angel in Zechariah chapter 1 again, verses 19 to 21 this time. I'll pop up the next picture there for the reference. So Zechariah 1, verses 19 to 21. Still the same day, the same month, the same year, under the rule of Darius I of Persia. It's a graphic representation of these 4 horns. And the key words, these are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. And so reading from verse 19, he asked the angel, "What are these?" And he answered me, "These are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." Then the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen. I asked, "What are these coming to do?" He answered, "These are the horns that scattered Judah, so that no one could raise his head, but the craftsmen have come to terrify them and throw down these horns of the nations who lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter its people." What do you think this is a reference to? 4 horns. We've covered other prophetic words of other prophets who spoke about things in the number of 4 as well. What do you think the 4 horns represent? We've had rams, we've had goats, we've had statues. What do they all speak about? They speak about 4 empires, the sequence of 4 empires. So the prophet Zechariah has shown a vision like that of the prophet Daniel saw some years ago. The 4 horns, or symbols of power, represent 4 kingdoms. Many commentators assume the 4 kingdoms align with Daniel's prophecy, namely that the Babylonians of the past, the Persians in the present, and the Greeks and the Romans yet to come in the future. The thing is here, though, is that there's a reference in this scripture that changes that expectation. And when the angel spoke to the prophet Zechariah, he said that these were the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. And so this not only refers to the events of the past, but specifically names Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. So we must understand that the horns that scattered them were actually Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, and Persia. Why? Because they're not going anywhere anymore. Okay? Now they've been returned, they're not going anywhere anymore. And so we're talking about the Babylonians and the Persians that are there now, but the Assyrians also scattered the people. Why? Because the scripture says Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. So the difference in this is that they've isolated Judah and Israel as two separately named entities, and then it says and Jerusalem, which is meant to be, of course, their capital, isn't it? So when we talk about Judah and Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, which was taken away by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom of Judah was eventually taken away by the Babylonians. But the horns that were scattered, where was some of the places that people went? And so they were taken away to Assyria. Remember, the people escaped into Egypt and went and hid in Egypt. The Babylonians went down and killed them all. And then, of course, we're talking about the Babylonians as we are, and now Persia. So this then means that the craftsmen who came to terrify them and throw down the horns of the nations must be whom? They're talking about what's going on now. The craftsmen, what does craftsmen do? They build things, don't they? They create things, they make things. And so what is their calling upon these people to do now? It's to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. So who are the craftsmen? So the craftsmen that we're talking about must be the leaders of the exiles who have returned. So at best we can only speculate as to who they are because they're not actually named in any specific way. But perhaps among those who are already in Jerusalem, we've got the governor Zerubbabel, and we've got Jeshua, the high priest, who is rebuilding the temple, and from those yet to return from exile, we've got Ezra, the priest, who will come and teach God's law, and we've also got a fourth one. Who comes after Ezra? Nehemiah. Nehemiah, the cupbearer, who will rebuild the city wall. So listen, we're talking about craftsmen, people who are going to build or rebuild. And so we've got Zerubbabel, the first person who was released from the exiles to come back to build the altar to God and the temple of Jerusalem. All right? The high priest, Jeshua, is with him doing the same. Second person. The third craftsman is Ezra, who will come back, followed by the fourth, who is Nehemiah, who's going to come and complete the walls. So these are the people who are responsible for rebuilding the laws, rebuilding the altar to God, the temple of Jerusalem, and of course the walls to protect the city again. So the prophet Zechariah then received yet another vision, and this time there was a man with a measuring line in his hand. And so we're going to now go to Zechariah chapter 2, verses 2 to 5. We're still at the same date, and there's a small reference there to what we're talking about, to measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and long it is. And so we're going to have a look at this one now. So Zechariah 2, verses 2 to 5. He asked him, "Where are you going?" He answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is." Then the angel who was speaking to me left, and another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it, and I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." And so this is quite unusual, but God's obviously saying that he will be their protector. And so they need to trust in God. So the governor Zerubbabel, Jeshua the high priest, and the remnant of the people who returned from exile were called to rebuild the temple, and the angels made it clear to them that Jerusalem will be a city without walls. Their purpose was not to rebuild the city walls. And so this prophetic word is because God's appointed another person to rebuild the city walls, and that is Nehemiah. And so this prophetic word, it's like David. David said, I want to build a temple, I want to build a temple. And God said, no, no, no. Your son Solomon's going to do that. So impetuous David, what did he do? He went and got the cedar logs and he started carving out blocks and he assembled everything ready for his son. But God said, you're not going to build it. And so Zechariah is telling these people here, don't go and measure it, don't go and plan and build any walls, because you're not going to be the people who build it, because Nehemiah is going to be that person. And so we see God's plan unfolding through the word of Zechariah. Can you imagine, these people have returned and they've had these people coming against them. And so they're fearful of the people and they stop building the temple of Jerusalem. That's what happened. And so these prophets have come back and said, hey, you lot, stop fearing what's going on around you. The people will take care of one another. I'm your protector. You will build this temple. And so what would they do if they're in fear? Their first instinct would be to build a wall to protect themselves. But God said, no, you're meant to be building the temple of Jerusalem. I will be your wall. I will protect you. And so this word of Zechariah is making it clear to them, don't think about the wall. Stop playing with your houses and just focus on the job at hand, build the temple of Jerusalem. So we find through this repetition and these visions that God is telling them exactly what to do. So the Lord then showed the prophet Zechariah, Joshua the high priest. He was standing before the angel with Satan standing to his right, ready to accuse him. So we're now going to go to Zechariah chapter 3, and these scriptures come out of the portion between verses 2 to 10. And so there's a representation of Joshua the high priest wearing the ephod, and you can see the small comment here, see, I have taken away your sin and I will put rich garments on you. So we'll work through this part of the prophecy now. So once again, he was standing before the angel with Satan standing to his right, ready to accuse him. But the Lord said to Satan in verse 2, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire? So Joshua the high priest had been supposedly snatched from the fire, for he was not left behind as prey for Satan, who sought to accuse him, as this portrayal describes, but rather he is justified by God's grace. So in this vision, Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes, symbolic of sin. That's why they were dirty. So the Lord told him to take them off and said in verse 4, see, I have taken away your sin and I will put rich garments on you. This is one of those moments where if you reflect on the Old Testament and a lot of what you read about, what happens when something goes wrong with the Israelites or the Jewish people? What do they do to themselves?
They put ash on.
Right, they tear their good clothes, they put on a sackcloth, and they put ashes on their head. They're dirty with sin. This is their way of representing or portraying that, yes, I am a sinner before you, Lord. I'm not worthy of these good garments. So I take them off and I belittle myself, I humble myself before you with these filthy clothes and the ash on my head, meaning that I am lower than the dirt. Okay? And so here, when he's talking about this, he's saying he's going to take off the dirty clothes and he's going to put on rich garments, which means that the sin that the people had been wearing, he's now saying we're going to remove that sin from you and we're now going to put on fresh garments. And so this is like a moving on. The exile period has happened, the punishment has been done, and so people are being restored back into relationship with God. And so this is symbolic of this. Then the angel of the Lord charged Joshua, and we're going to read now between verses 7 to 10. So the Lord charged Joshua, this is what the Lord Almighty says. If you will walk in my ways and keep my requirements, then you will govern my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you a place among these standing here. Listen, O high priest Joshua, and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant the branch. Who's the branch? I am going to bring my servant the branch. Anyone come across this?
The Israelites.
No. The branch is actually a future prophecy referring to the Messiah. And so we'll continue to explain. So once again, he says this is what's happening now, and this is what's going to happen in the future. He goes on to read, see the stone I have set in front of Joshua. There are 7 eyes or facets or sides, whatever you understand, on that one stone, and I will engrave an inscription on it, says the Lord Almighty, and I will remove the sin of this land in a single day. In that day, each of you will invite his neighbour to sit under his vine and fig tree, declares the Lord Almighty. This is how we know it's the Messiah, because it says, I'll remove the sin of this land in a single day. The day that Jesus was crucified for the sins in the land in front of the temple of Jerusalem. So Joshua the high priest is given the promise of the Messiah when God says, I'm going to bring my servant the branch. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah had already made known that the branch was the coming Messiah, because they too speak of the Messiah in the term of the branch. And on that day that he will come, he will make atonement or pay the price for all sin once and for all. So throughout the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, we find that the prophets keep a pace of what's going on then, but they always point to the future when the Messiah will come. And so this is another reflection on that. So after the Lord had shown Joshua the high priest to the prophet Zechariah, the angel who had been talking to him returned and asked him, what did he see now? And so the prophet said, we're going to now go to Zechariah chapter 4 and yet another image, and we have what we see here. I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it between 2 olive trees. Zechariah 4, we're going to be looking at verses between 3 and 7. So verse 3, the prophet said, I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it, with 7 channels to the lights. Also there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left. After describing what he saw, the prophet asked the angel what these things were, and he said in verses 6 to 7, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become level ground, then he will bring out the capstone to shouts of, God bless it, God bless it. And so we see once again that the Lord is saying that these things are going to happen through Zerubbabel. What's a capstone? Any understanding what a capstone is? How do you use a capstone?
To seal something.
To seal something, right. So it's the last thing that you place when you're building a wall. So when he speaks about Zerubbabel and a capstone, Zerubbabel was commanded, or he was commissioned to do what? To rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. And so the capstone represents that Zerubbabel will be the person who will finish rebuilding the temple of Jerusalem. And so God says, so he's being very specific. He's saying this will happen under the leadership of Zerubbabel. That was what he was tasked with. And when King Cyrus the Great released his people, Zerubbabel was appointed to be the one to rebuild. And so he says he's not just going to rebuild, but he's going to finish it as well. And so we're following the genealogy of Jesus. Zerubbabel is the son of Shealtiel, who is the son of the former King Jehoiachin. And we find that he's tasked with this very, very important role, that he's the one that's been appointed. He's not a king. The Lord said no more kings, but he appointed him as a leader to come back and to rebuild his temple. So then the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, and the Lord said in verses 9 to 10 of Zechariah 4, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands will also complete it. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you, Who despises the day of small things? Men will rejoice when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. And so we can see from this that Zerubbabel is a very significant person. God chose him to be the one to do this. So the prophet went back to his vision and asked what the two olive trees represented. And the angel said in verse 14, "These are the two who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth." Who do you think the two are? Who are the two who are appointed to serve the Lord of the earth? We're talking about the present circumstances. What's the structure of society? Who are the two people who lead God's people?
Was the leader and the priest.
Thank you, perfect. So there's a leader, whether it be a king or not, but a leader, and the high priest. One serves the people and represents them to God, and one serves God and represents him to the people. There's an interchange between those two roles. And so we find here that these two who were anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth, it says that that's an anointing. It's not just oh, look, let's get that guy or this lady to lead us. This is God saying these are the two people. And so the two who were anointed was Zerubbabel the governor and Joshua the high priest, the prince and the priest, imbued with the gift and grace of the Spirit of God. The Lord said to them through the prophet Haggai in Haggai 2 verse 5, and you've already read this, it says, "My spirit remains among you." So in other words, I've appointed you and my spirit resides in you to lead my people to do this task. So they were instruments in the service of God, from whose union the fullness of grace was received and imparted. They will build the temple of the Lord. So once again, we find through all these prophetic words that it's very specific. God's sorting them all out and saying, look, this is who's to do what, this is what I want you to do. And he's being very, very clear to the people. So although Zerubbabel the governor, Joshua the high priest, and the remnant people of Judah were graced with the Spirit of God and charged with the task of rebuilding his temple, the obedience of God's people to his will not last. Typical repetition story of the Old Testament and through to today. So this was revealed to the prophet Zechariah through two more visions. The first one, a flying scroll, and the second one, a woman in a basket. And so we're going to now have a look at these. So the first vision shows a flying scroll. So we're going to go to Zechariah chapter 5, and we're going to verses 3 to 4. So we have a graphic representation. Some people like to illustrate something that looks like the magic carpet flying through the sky. But a scroll is actually on these two rollers, if you will, on either side, and it goes from one to the other. So this has been represented in the more formal way. And it says, this is the curse that is going out over the whole land. So let's read from Zechariah 5 verses 3 to 4. The angel explains, this is the curse that is going out over the whole land, for according to what it says on one side, every thief will be banished, and according to what it says on the other, everyone who swears falsely will be banished. The Lord Almighty declares, I will send it out, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of him who swears falsely by my name. It will remain in his house and destroy it. So in other words, there's two types of people living in the land. There's those who aren't being obedient to God, and there's those who are saying they are being obedient to God, but in fact they're not. And so they're going to be both treated the same. So the second vision showed a measuring basket. And so I'll pop up this next one. So we're going to go to verses 6 to 11 of Zechariah 5. And this is the key reference, the iniquity or the sin of the people, meaning the Jewish people, throughout the land. It's a pretty interesting picture. This is a woven basket. It actually has a lid. I believe it's made out of lead. I'll check in a second. And they have this lady inside the basket. And so the second vision shows a measuring basket which is classed as an ephah in volume, which is apparently about 23 litres, or a liquid measure equivalent to a bath. Now, where do I find that? If you want to look it up, you can go to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 45, verse 11. So it actually tells you what that is. And it says that in verse 6 of Zechariah 5, that this basket, this measuring basket, represented the iniquity or the sin of the people, meaning the Jewish people, throughout the land. So the basket had a cover of lead, which was, when lifted, revealed the woman sitting inside, whom the angel called in Zechariah chapter 5, verse 8. He called this woman wickedness. So the angel pushed her back inside, and after sealing the lid, 2 more women with wings lifted up the basket and took it. And in Zechariah 5, verse 11, it says, they took it to the country of Babylonia to build a house for it, where it was left. The woman in the basket represented the sinful nation of Jews who will be taken and forced to dwell in captivity in far-off places like those who had been held in Babylonian exile. This was then followed by another vision which showed 4 chariots coming from between 2 mountains. This vision confirms earlier prophetic words given by Isaiah and Jeremiah. So again, another reference. I'm going to keep moving through these, because there's a few of them. Zechariah 6, verses 5 to 8, and it's the key reference there, the 4 spirits or winds of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord. So here's these colours of the different horses pulling the chariots. So the third vision showed 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains of bronze, led by powerful red, black, white and dappled horses, whom the angel explained were the 4 spirits or winds of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. That's from Zechariah 6, verse 5. Now the red horses denote war and bloodshed, hence the red colour. War and bloodshed. It said the red horses stayed, while the black horses, who denote the outcome of war, so black represents famine, pestilence and desolation, went toward the north country. The white horses, who denote the return of comfort, peace and prosperity, went toward the west, and the dappled or mixed colour horses, who denote occasions that vary between prosperity and adversity, went toward the south. And so this is Zechariah 6, verses 5 to 6. So they went throughout the earth, and the angel said in verse 8, look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north. So the black horses who went toward the north and gave God's spirit rest represent the Medes and the Persians who executed God's judgment upon the Babylonians. Remember, the biblical reference is that they will come from the north, so we're talking about the Babylonians. The people of Judah were delivered from captivity, and the Babylonians in the future will experience famine, pestilence and desolation, hence the other coloured horse. And this was also spoken about by the prophet Isaiah. I'll give you the reference if you want to look it up. Isaiah 13 verses 19 to 20. So Isaiah 13 verses 19 to 20. And also Jeremiah in Jeremiah 50 verse 39. They both prophesied the same. So after the visions were received and explained by the angel, the prophet Zechariah then received a word of the Lord. And so he was told to take silver and gold from exiles called Haggai, Tobiah and Jedaiah, who had just arrived from Babylon, and give it to Josiah, son of Zephaniah, to make a crown and set it on the head of Joshua the high priest, and tell him that this is what the Lord Almighty said. So we go to verses 12 and 13 of Zechariah 6. So continuing on from those other ones, Zechariah 6 verses 12 to 13. It says, this is what the Lord Almighty said. Here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will branch out from this place and build the temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty, and will sit and rule on his throne, and there will be a harmony between the two. The crown was then to be placed in the temple as a memorial. The crown was placed on the head of the high priest Joshua, as a symbolic public act to foreshadow the future coming of the branch or the Messiah, who would be both king and priest. The physical temple was still to be built by the governor Zerubbabel and the high priest Josiah, but the future spiritual temple will be built by the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who will branch out from this place to build the temple of the Lord. When the temple was finished, the crown was to be solemnly placed in it and kept there as evidence of the future promise of the Messiah. And so we see that there's a crown made and placed in the temple to remind those who were going to come through the future generations until the Messiah came, that there's a future promise that there is a Messiah that whom will come. Okay, so that's sort of rattling through the prophecies of Zechariah. We could spend a lot more time on them, but it's to give you a feel for what's happening. There's a lot going on with those. So after 16 years have passed in Jerusalem, building work on the temple finally restarted on the 29th of August, 520 BC. So I have a nice picture here for you of building works going on. So again, 16 years there'd been no building happening, so it's quite a long time. Remember that King Cyrus the Great overtook Syria in 539 BC. The exiles were released in 536 BC, it's now 520 BC. And so 16 years have passed and virtually no building work had been done on the temple. So you can imagine why God placed his prophets amongst them and wasn't very happy with them. And so in the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 14, it says, "So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo." And so this scriptural reference tells us that the two prophets were there amongst them, and when they started to be obedient to what God called them to do, it says that they began to prosper. So 2 years after the foundation of the temple was laid, on the 4th day of the 9th month of Kislev, so this is in November or December in 518 BC, in the 4th year of King Darius of Persia, we're going to go to Zechariah chapter 7 now, verses 2 to 3. So staying with the book of Zechariah at the moment. Zechariah 7, verses 2 to 3. It says, "The people of Bethel had sent Sereza and Regem-melech together with their men to entreat the Lord by asking the priests of the house of the Lord Almighty and the prophets, 'Should I mourn and fast in the 5th month as I have done for so many years?' The prophet Zechariah received a word of the Lord, and he was told to ask both the people who had come and the priests in Jerusalem," reading from verses 5 to 6, "When you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months for the past 70 years, was it really for me that you fasted? And when you were eating and drinking, were you not just feasting for yourselves?" And so what's this comment saying? It's saying that they're being very religious, but there's no sincerity in what they're doing. They've observed something for the sake of observing it. With the second temple nearly complete, the people from the sub-province of Judea wanted to know whether they should continue to fast and mourn the fall of the first temple that took place in the 5th month of 586 BC. So there's the reason for the 5th month. But the word of the Lord given through the prophet Zechariah rebuked their fasting as ceremonial and only practiced for the benefit of others. He told them to seek true worship with a sincere heart, otherwise they were no better than their forefathers 70 years earlier. So after urging the people to obedience, the prophet Zechariah receives another of the word of the Lord, in which God tells him in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 3, God tells him that he will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. So once again, he's saying, when the temple's built, I will come back and reside there. He encourages them with a promise of coming prosperity. So Zechariah 8, verse 4 to 5 reads, "Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with cane in hand because of his age. The city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there." And so a rosy picture being painted. The Lord told them he will save them and bless them, but they must be strong and rebuild the temple. He also told them what to do. So going to verses 16 to 17 in Zechariah 8, he says, "Speak the truth to each other and render true and sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against your neighbour, and do not love to swear falsely." They were to make the fast of the 4th, 5th, 7th and 10th months. It says in Zechariah 8 verse 19, "Joyful and glad occasions and happy festivals for Judah. Therefore love truth and peace." And so he's telling his people to be sincere, joyful, but they must not swear falsely, and they must not come against their neighbour. Just reading on, so therefore love truth and peace in Zechariah 8 verse 19, and told of how in Zechariah 8 verse 22, so I'm just picking the highlights out of this, how many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord Almighty and entreat him. And finally in verse 23, "In those days 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, 'Let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you.'" And so what this is saying is that people are going to come from other places and want to be a part of this because they can see that they are prosperous. And so he tells them that this will actually happen. So we come to the point now that Zerubbabel had laid the foundation stone, and now as he brought out and laid the final capstone of the second temple, what did Zechariah said the people will do? In chapter 4 verse 7 he said the people would shout, "God bless it, God bless it." So Zerubbabel the governor, Joshua the high priest, and the remnant people in the province of Judea finally completed the second temple. In Ezra chapter 6 verse 15, so we're going to spend a little bit of time for the final portion in the book of Ezra. So we can go to Ezra chapter 6 verse 15. So we've had all of the warnings and the information provided by the prophets, and now we're going to revert to the book of Ezra. So Ezra 6 verse 15, it says, "The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius." So this is the 17th of March in 516 BC. It then goes on to say in Ezra, I'm going to read a few verses from chapter 6 verse 16, and then I'm going to read from 18 to 19 and then from verse 22. So it reads, "Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy." Then on to the next portion. "And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God in Jerusalem according to what is written in the book of Moses." So this was 18 to 19. "On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover." And in verse 22, "For 7 days they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the Lord had fulfilled them with joy." And so we see that these ordinances are coming back into place again. So after the completion and dedication of the second temple of Jerusalem, God's plan of restoration took another step forward when the priest Ezra, son of Seraiah, a direct descendant of the first high priest Aaron, I don't know if you know that, but he's a direct descendant of Aaron, prepared to leave the province of Babylon with the blessing and decree of King Darius I to administer justice and teach God's law in Jerusalem and the province of Judea. And so we find that Ezra is still in Babylon. So reading from Ezra chapter 7, first verse 1, and then I'm going to go from verses 6 to 7. Verse 1 reads, "After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Seraiah," and then from 6 to 7, "came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. Some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants, also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes." And so suddenly we find ourselves with a different name for the king. So does this mean that we now have a different king, or does this mean that we're just using a title? And so this is one of the complexities when we're reading this period of time, because depending on who's writing depends on the name that's actually given. And so in this instance, we're talking about King Darius I, is known as, in this scripture, Artaxerxes. Okay? And so this is hopefully to help you avoid the confusion. So Ezra the priest went to King Darius I to seek permission to return to Jerusalem with a number of his people. Having already established and honoured the decree issued by King Cyrus the Great, King Darius I, or Artaxerxes, granted Ezra the priest what he needed and gave him a letter to take with him. And it reads, so we're going to read from Ezra 7, and we're going to read all the way from verses 13 to 26. So this is the letter that was given to Ezra the priest. It says, "Now I decree that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including priests and Levites, who volunteer to go to Jerusalem with you may go. You are sent by the king and his 7 advisers to inquire about Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of your God, which is in your hand. Moreover, you are to take with you the silver and gold that the king and his advisers have freely given to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, together with all the silver and gold you may obtain from the province of Babylon, as well as the freewill offerings of the people and priests for the temple of their God in Jerusalem. With this money be sure to buy bulls, rams and male lambs, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, and sacrifice them on the altar of the temple of your God in Jerusalem." And so before I continue to read, we can see the next step being enacted here. First it's the altar of God, then it's the temple of Jerusalem. Now Ezra the priest is coming to put into place all of the ordinances that are to be practiced, and the king is actually providing him with the means to do so. It continues to read, "You and your fellow Israelites may then do whatever seems best with the rest of the silver and gold, in accordance with the will of your God. Deliver to the God of Jerusalem all the articles entrusted to you for worship in the temple of your God, and anything else needed for the temple of your God that you are responsible to supply, you may provide from the royal treasury. Now I, King Artaxerxes, decree that all the treasurers of Trans-Euphrates are to provide with diligence whatever Ezra the priest, the teacher of the law of God of heaven, may ask of you." Remember, I mentioned this last week. Trans-Euphrates is a greater province, so it's from the Euphrates River across to the Mediterranean Sea. So it's also, they actually call it the West Euphrates, and Judea is actually a sub-province, like it's a smaller region within the greater one. But in the Bible, they call it Trans-Euphrates, okay? And you might remember that last week, it's the actual governor and the officer of the Trans-Euphrates who was actually coming against them and trying to stop them from rebuilding. So they're now receiving instructions to actually provide everything they need. Okay, now it goes on to say here, so I'll just reread that last bit, that all the treasurers of Trans-Euphrates are to provide with diligence whatever Ezra the priest, the teacher of the law of God, may ask of you, up to 100 talents, so that's 3,000 kilograms of silver, 100 cores, that's 18 tons of wheat, 100 baths, that's 22,000 litres, 2,200 litres of wine, 100 baths or 2,200 litres of olive oil, and salt without limit. Whatever the God of heaven has prescribed, let it be done with diligence for the temple of the God of heaven. Why should his wrath fall on the realm of the king and his sons? You are also to know that you have no authority to impose taxes, tribute or duty on any of the priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, temple servants, or other workers at this house of God. So in other words, he's enforcing the very laws that God put on his own people. And you, Ezra, in accordance with the wisdom of your God, which you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to administer justice to all the people of Trans-Euphrates, all who know the laws of your God, and you are to teach any who do not know them. Whoever does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. And remember the prophecy that Zechariah just gave? It said that if they weren't obedient to God, they'd be carried off in the basket back to. Well, here he is saying here that if they don't obey the laws, that they'll be punished by death, banishment, which means that they're going to be sent away, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. So here again, I'll just mention, we again did cover this last week. These are the throne names. So Artaxerxes means righteous ruler. It's not an actual person's name. So Darius was a righteous ruler. He was the one who followed up the decree of his great uncle, King Cyrus the Great. And sometimes in the Bible we have Xerxes, which means ruling over heroes. Okay, so when King Darius I issued his decree that enabled Zerubbabel to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, he said how he wanted the priests to pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. Notice in this decree he talks about he doesn't want anything to happen to him or his sons. So we get a repeat of this. His motivation was very personal. Here again the king issued another decree. This time it was for the benefit of Ezra the priest. But the king said, why should there be wrath against the realm of the king and his sons? So his reverence for the God of Israel influenced him to issue decrees he deemed necessary to preserve his realm, his family, and himself. So when Ezra received this decree from the king, he praised the Lord, and it says in Ezra 7 verses 27 to 28, who had put it into the king's heart to bring honour to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favour to me before the king and his advisers and all the king's powerful officials. And we hear this more and more, that God puts it upon people's heart. So God speaks to us in the heart. So this encouraged Ezra the priest, so he sent out a call to gather the leading Israelite men who wanted to leave. So they all came and assembled at a canal that flows toward the Hava River, where they camped for 3 days. So this is one of the canals south of the city of Babylon, used for irrigating crops. So amongst them were 1,496 men who came with their families under the leadership of their family heads, joined by 38 Levites and 220 temple servants. Those statistics come out of Ezra chapter 8, between verses 2 and 20, so I'm not going to list all of the detail. Now Ezra the priest did not ask for protection on their pending trip, because he told the king in verse 22 of Ezra 8, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, but his great anger is against all who forsake him. So while they were assembled at the side of the Ahava canal, he proclaimed a fast to humble themselves before God and petition for a safe journey, and God answered their prayer. And so we learn here that as it was when they were exiled out of Judah across to Babylon, we find that when they returned, that not everybody went back in one go, which we knew when we spoke about Zerubbabel when he left. But here we find that Ezra is coming, and he's going to bring another group of people with him. So the final task for Ezra to complete before they departed was to distribute the offering that they had received. In verse 25 of Ezra 8, it says, received of silver and gold, and the articles that the king, his advisors, his officials, and all Israel had donated for the house of God. So the offering was divided and given to 24 leading priests and Levites who were consecrated to the Lord to guard and carry it to the house in Jerusalem. Now Ezra the priest weighed out to them, and we're going to get this information from verses 26 and 27. So each of them had 650 talents of silver, so that's 19,000 kilograms of silver. Silver articles weighing 100 talents, that's 3,000 kilograms. 100 talents of gold, that's 3,000 kilograms. 20 bowls of gold valued at 1,000 darics, that's 8.5 kilograms. And 2 fine articles of polished bronze as precious as gold. And so, as I like to do, I like to put a value on these things just so we comprehend this. Remember we spoke about in the earlier lesson how when the people went back, they weren't poor. They went back with servants, they went back with livestock, and they went back with millions of dollars worth of gold and silver. Well, this is what this offering adds up to. It's even more astonishing than that was taken by Zerubbabel, which I think added up to somewhere around 24 million modern US dollars when we added that up. This adds up to 3,008 kilograms of gold, valued today at a staggering US $128.8 million. And the 22,000 kilograms of silver is valued at $11.7 million. And so we have 140.5 million US dollars worth of gold and silver taken back by these people for the temple of the Lord. And so extraordinary sums of value. So reading on, Ezra 8 verse 31, on the 12th day of the first month we set out from a harbour canal to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. In 515 BC, in Ezra 7 verse 8, Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king, so it gave a date for it, so that's why I've stepped back with that one. He rested for 3 days with the people he had brought with him, and on the 4th he took the consecrated priests and Levites with him to weigh and deliver the silver, gold and sacred articles to the house of the Lord. The returned exiles then made their burnt offerings to the God of Israel, and finally in Ezra 8 verse 36, they also delivered the king's orders to the royal satraps, that's the governors, and to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, who then gave assistance to the people and to the house of God. And so as they travelled from one location across to Jerusalem, all of the different regions they passed through, the governors were obliged to help them along the way. So after settling in, the leaders came to Ezra the priest, and they confessed this to him in Ezra 9 verses 1 to 2. It says, the people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighbouring peoples with their detestable practices like those of the Canaanites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials had led the way in this unfaithfulness. When Ezra the priest heard this, he was distraught. So what did he do? He tore his clothes, pulled hair from his head and beard, and it says, sat down in verse 4, appalled until the evening sacrifice, where he rose only to fall on his knees. Spreading his hands out before the Lord, Ezra the priest prayed and acknowledged the sin and the guilt of his people that had caused them to be subject, it says in verse 7, to the sword and captivity, to pillage and humiliation at the hand of foreign kings. So he's returned and found that the people are disobeying this fundamental law that God gave to his people. So already a remnant population of the former kingdom, Ezra the priest understood the predicament his people had once again placed themselves in, and in his prayer he asked the Lord in verse 14, would you not be angry enough with us to destroy us, leaving us no remnant or survivor? And so you may remember when they first went into the land of Canaan, God told his people not to intermingle and marry with foreign people. And of course, his people have gone back from the second period of exile after Egypt, and the same things happened again. So as Ezra the priest prayed and wept forlorn before the house of God, a large crowd of people began to gather, and they wept with him. So I have a final picture here for you. So here they are gathered before the house of the Lord, and all of the people starting to assemble before him. From amongst them, Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, said to Ezra, so we're going to read Ezra chapter 10 now, so we're motoring through the book of Ezra, chapter 10 verses 2 to 3. We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the peoples around us. But in spite of this, there is still hope for Israel. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law. So Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, then placed the matter in the hands of Ezra the priest and told him that they would support him. So Ezra the priest had the leading priests, Levites and men of Israel take an oath there before the house of God. A proclamation was issued throughout the sub-province of Judea, asking all returned exiles to assemble in Jerusalem within 3 days. They were also told not to ignore this, for if they chose not to come, they would be forced to give up their property and be expelled from the assembly. They all heeded the warning and came. On the 20th day of the 9th month, 4 months after Ezra the priest had arrived in 515 BC, all the men from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin sat worried before the house of God in the pouring rain. So Ezra addressed them in chapter 10, verses 10 to 11. You have been unfaithful. Ezra 10, chapter 10, verses 10 to 11. You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people around you and from your foreign wives. So you can imagine what this endeavour was, standing there before all these men who had married these women and now had children, and then coming together and actually agreeing to send them all away. What an extraordinary thing to do. And so you can imagine what this moment must have been like. So the assembly of men agreed, but because it was the rainy season, they asked that those who had married foreign women be allowed to arrive at set times, so they weren't all standing outside soaking wet over an extended period of time. This was agreed to, and on the first day of the 10th month, in December to January of 515 BC, the men who Ezra the priest had selected to investigate each case sat down and processed the claims as they came forward. By the first day of the first month, that's March to April in 514 BC, so it took quite a long time, they finished dealing with the men who had married foreign women. Those guilty of intermarriage among the descendants of the priests, the Levites, and all other Israelites are listed in the book of Ezra under the title, Those Guilty of Intermarriage. So if you would like to look up those names and cast spurn upon them, you can go to Ezra chapter 8 and read verses 18 to 44. So listed as those guilty of intermarriage. Zerubbabel and his children, already born at that time, are not amongst those listed. So of course we're following Zerubbabel in the genealogy of Jesus, and so we know that his kids are not amongst them. That's very important because they're going to be amongst the forefathers of the Messiah. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the story of the time of Zerubbabel. I'm just going to finish off with a few notes about some of the references in Scripture. Next lesson, we're going to go to a descendant who I asked you, I think I said a bit earlier his name, you may remember, but his name is called Abiud. So A-B-I-U-D. In Hebrew it's Abihud, so it's A-B-I-H-U-D. And so he's the next descendant. So here we've read through the story of Zerubbabel, and much has happened. He's returned from Babylonian exile. We've had an incredible amount of input from prophets over the weeks we've been having a look at it. They come back to build the Temple of Jerusalem. We had the change of kings of the Persian empires with the usurpers who tried to take over from King Cyrus's son until his great nephew Darius I came and straightened things out. And then of course we have the story focused on the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, the altar, and now the return of the priesthood in order to put everything back into place. And the first order of business was to get rid of those guilty of intermarriage. And so this is the journey of Zerubbabel, who not only led his people, but he was anointed and appointed by God to lead them, and he also was the governor during that period of time. And so he had a considerable amount of power. And so at this point in time, once Zerubbabel falls off the radar in terms of his journey, we now start following the Bible, but we don't specifically follow the descendants' story because there is no independent story right now all through to the time of Jesus. However, the Bible continues on and history continues on, and we will follow it all through. So going back, the promise made to King David, just wrapping up, continued. Zerubbabel had not ruled as a king like his forefather, but he did lead his people and govern them with the authority of God. The covenant of King David's descendants was protected by God, but they were not all destined to rule. Zerubbabel had numerous children, And they're listed in the royal line. It's called the royal line after the exile in the first book of Chronicles. So again, the genealogy paints this picture. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 19, so again 1 Chronicles 3 verse 19, it lists Meshullam and Hananiah. Shelomith was their sister, and there were also 5 others, Hashubah, Ahel, Berechiah, Hasadiah, and Jushab-Hesed. And those listed in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel according to Matthew, it says in Matthew 1 verse 13, Zerubbabel, the father of Abiad. So this is a crucial moment in the genealogy of Jesus, for Zerubbabel's son, who succeeds him, has no personal testimony, as I just mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. We can know what happened during his life, however, from the account given of his people in the book of Nehemiah and then the book of Esther. So they're the books that are upcoming. As they established themselves in Jerusalem and the province of Judea, the newly settled exiles brought out of captivity and settled into the promised land for the second time were encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to be sincere in their worship and obedience to God to receive his full blessing. After Zerubbabel's children are named in the first book of Chronicles, the descendants of King David cease being recorded in the Old Testament. So this is another factor that happens here. So again, after the Zerubbabel's children are named in the first book of Chronicles, there are no more descendants of King David recorded in the Old Testament. So following Zerubbabel's tenure as governor of Judea, his children have no position of prominence and will sink into obscurity. That comment, by the way, what I mentioned about the Old Testament, means that at this point in time we leave from Old Testament genealogy to genealogy of Jesus, Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. There's nothing in between the two. So following Zerubbabel's tenure as governor of Judea, his children have no position of prominence and will sink into obscurity. Their home, governed by the laws of inheritance, is where? Where is the home for Zerubbabel's children? What's their inheritance? No. Where is the Messiah going to come from? Where did the first descendant, Salmon, live? Where did his son Boaz have a farm? Bethlehem. And so their inheritance, so it's like you've got the palace and the capital, but that's not their inheritance. Their inheritance is their land. It's like in the English system, isn't it? You've got the lords in the old feudal system, and they have a representation of a parcel of land, and then they attend Parliament as the representatives of those people who live in that area. There's no difference with what's going on here. And so we find at this particular point in time that they go back in their inheritance where their forefather Salmon first came to the promised land. So when Zerubbabel was governor and he has his children, it means that there's now another governor comes along. There's no palace, there's no king. And so that means that his family would reside back in the inherited land. And so genealogical books and tables were always kept by the Jewish people, but whilst none of their names after Zerubbabel in the genealogy of Jesus are found in the Old Testament, they were accessible and almost certainly taken from carefully kept public and family registers available at the time. So the Jewish people are known for their record keeping. Jewish accuracy has never been questioned because local government officials always kept genealogical records that were accessible to ensure the proper rules of inheritance were followed. That's what it was always about. When we read the Holy Bible, we find that not every firstborn son received their father's inheritance either. We've known that through the period of Kings, for example. Hence, we shouldn't expect that, without exception, that Abiad from the genealogy of Jesus, the next son as a forefather of Jesus, is the same son as Zerubbabel's firstborn, which was called Meshullam. So knowing that extensive records were kept and that Abiad was not listed by the chronicler found in the first book of Chronicles at the time, would probably simply suggest he was not yet born at the time the record was taken. So in other words, there's children being born at different points in time. He recorded up to a certain point in time, and then there's no more record. And yet in the genealogy of Jesus, we have another name, and so it's suggested that he was a younger child. So it's here that the journey of the descendants of King David in the genealogy of Jesus almost comes to an end in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament in the Holy Bible. The Hebrew Bible does continue to follow the plight of God's people, though, as they continue to return from exile and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in the province of Judea during the reign of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and that's where we're going to continue with next week. Okay, so that draws us to a close. So I hope you've been able to absorb as much of that as possible. As we say each week, all of these lessons are recorded. You can watch it back on Facebook, or you can go to our YouTube channel, type in Paul Brunson, the Jesus Movement. You can subscribe there, you can watch the videos, you can pause them, you can look up the references. All of the references that I speak of, they're all subtitled on the videos in order for you to watch it back. And these same videos are also available on our website, thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next time.